Hello everyone, this is Krista Martell with the Well Project, and I am pleased to welcome you to our second webinar for 2018. Today's webinar is HIV Criminalization in Women, and it's a roundtable conversation with survivors. We're just going to wait a few minutes to let more people join in, and we'll get started. I also going to put in the chat box a couple links. One is a link to the slide set that we'll be using today in case anyone has connection problems and they want to kind of follow along. They can click on that to follow the slides. A second link that we'll be putting up is a link to our fact sheet on this topic, just so you have additional resources. With that, I will post a couple links. You're welcome to, we encourage everyone just to say hello and maybe where you're from in the chat box. I know we'll have people both from the U.S. and outside the U.S., and it's always great to see the diverse people and places that are here on the webinar. Hi, it's great to see a lot of familiar faces. Hi, Caroline and Sophia, and Angelina, London. Hi, Kamaria. All right, so I've posted the link to today's slides, and I will also just now post the link to our fact sheet, which just is a good reference to have for after the webinar. And then we'll get going. Okay. All right, so once again, for those who have just joined, this is Krista Martell. I'm the Executive Director of the Well Project, and really pleased to have everyone here for this webinar, including our amazing presenters and panelists. Today's webinar is HIV Criminalization in Women, and it's a roundtable conversation with survivors. We are very excited to have this topic and such an amazing group of people to share experiences and help build awareness around this topic. So we are going to get going now. And again, for those who just joined, feel free to post your name and where you're from in the chat box, and we welcome you all here. So today's agenda is I'll do a very brief introduction of who's joining us today, and then we'll do a little bit more in-depth introductions further down in the meeting, today's webinar. Then we will have a presentation by Carrie Foote on the background on HIV criminalization in women. Then we will go to our roundtable discussion with survivors, and then we will also have Q&A. We also encourage you, if you have questions during the presentations or the panel discussion, just to post them in the chat box or the question box, and we will try and keep track of those and pose those during the Q&A. So we're not going to go into longer introductions. We'll save those for a little bit later, but today we are very pleased to have Dr. Carrie Foote here to provide a presentation and overview of HIV criminalization in women, and then a group of amazing panelists and activists, including Monique Howell, Tiami Janae Luckett, Tiffany Moore, and Jessica Whitbread. And as some of you may have seen in our earlier communications, Julie Graham was also supposed to join us, but unfortunately had something come up. So Carrie's going to provide a little overview of Julie's experiences when we get to the roundtable. So she's going to be with us here in spirit. And again, I'm Krista Martell, the Executive Director of the WELL Project. So just quickly, webinar details. The webinar is going to last approximately 90 minutes. It includes Q&A. And as we've already said, to use the live chat box to enter questions while presenters speak, and we'll put those questions in a queue for answering at the end. Participants' lines are muted, and we can unmute during Q&A if requested. And then just a little bit about our series, WATCH. This is our third year of doing this webinar series. WATCH stands for Women's Advocacy and Treatment Coalition on HIV. We try and cover different topics to build education and advocacy around various important topics. We encourage those that are here on the webinar to utilize the resources that we provide during this webinar to then go out and help build awareness with others. So in our fact sheets, you'll see a slide set that you can download and use in your own educational or advocacy work. So this year's series will include 3 webinars. We'll have one more later this year, and we'll be announcing more details around that soon. The webinar is going to be recorded and will be posted on our website after, and we'll send out a notice when that's available. We'll also include additional resources about this webinar on the webpage. And if someone is interested in getting a certificate for completion, you can just send us a message. Okay, so before we start and I hand it over to Carrie, we're going to ask a few poll questions. So we just ask, and there's no right or wrong answer. We just want to get kind of gauge what the participants' knowledge is around this topic and what your interest is in learning more. So, so the first poll question reads, HIV criminalization has been shown to keep communities healthy / keep people HIV negative. So true, false, or not sure? Okay, so we'll give it just another 10 seconds or so for people to enter in. Can you all see the percentages? Any of my presenters?
Yes, I can see them.
Great. Okay, so as you can see, so we're going to go ahead and close this poll question. So the majority, 86%, think this statement is false. A small 9% thinks true, and 5% are not sure. So I'm going to close this poll, and then we're going to ask 2 more questions. Sorry. Okay. The next question is, I'm mostly interested in this webinar because I don't know much about HIV criminalization, and I want to understand the practices. That got cut off. I want to learn more about how people can bring charges against partners, or I want more information about advocacy against these laws. Okay, I'll go ahead and start closing this poll up. But as you can see, the majority want more information about advocacy against these laws, and then some are just interested in getting more information about HIV criminalization. A small percentage wants to learn more about how people can bring charges. So I'm going to close this poll, and then we will have one more question. Okay, so the last poll question is, I'm aware of whether or not my state or country prosecutes people based on HIV positive status. Yes, no, or not sure. Okay, so it looks like the majority of our participants are aware of their states or countries' laws around HIV criminalization. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this poll up, and I am going back to the slides, and I will now hand it over to Carrie. And Carrie, if you want to give a brief intro of yourself before you start into the presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Am I coming through clear?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So welcome everyone to the webinar. This is pretty exciting to have this topic talking about women and HIV criminalization. And we have an amazing group of panelists here who will share their experiences a little bit later. Just a little bit about my background. My name is Carrie Foote. I am the chair of the HIV Modernization Movement, Indiana, which is working to reform our laws here in the state of Indiana and modernize them to end prosecutions against people living with HIV in our state. I am also a woman living with HIV. I contracted HIV from injection drug use. When I was a teenager, I tested positive in 1988. So that's a little bit about my background in my kind of professional work. I'm a professor of sociology at Indiana University in Indianapolis. So I'm just going to share a little bit of background on HIV criminalization because we do have different understandings of what it is, what's wrong with the laws, and that sort of thing. So just I'll go through these slides fairly quickly so we can get into the roundtable. But basically, what is HIV criminalization? It's basically the idea that behind this is that no one should be punished simply because they have a health condition. But in many areas of the world, we have laws and practices that unfairly punish people living with HIV. As of now, there are 73 countries and 29 U.S. states that have HIV-specific criminal laws. We call this HIV criminalization. So what is this in more detail? What do we mean by this? It's basically the arrest, prosecution, imprisonment of people living with HIV for things that are perfectly legal or only minor crimes for people who have not tested HIV positive. In other words, our HIV status is used as a standalone basis to single out people living with HIV for unique and discriminatory treatment by criminal legal justice systems around the world. It's important to really understand that this can occur both under HIV-specific laws that apply only to people living with HIV, but it can also happen under our general criminal laws like battery laws, assault laws, where charges or punishment are initiated or heightened solely because of a person's HIV status. And that's really important to know because it really doesn't matter what your legal system is and whether you have an HIV-specific law, that because of stigma and discrimination, people living with HIV around the world face possible arrest and prosecution within their criminal justice system. So that's important to understand. And then when thinking of these laws, they're really diverse. Most of them, and ones you'll hear most that people talk about, are HIV non-disclosure laws, where basically it's non-disclosure of HIV status prior to engaging in consensual sexual activities or needle sharing activities. But there are other ways that people living with HIV have been criminalized. Just exposure to any body fluids while HIV positive, sex solicitation while HIV positive. Many experiences involve acts that pose absolutely zero risk of HIV transmission, including spitting, biting, scratching, oral sex, or sex using treatment prevention methods, whether it's condom use, your partner might have been using PrEP, or you had an undetectable viral load. So I'm going to go through these next few slides, just some examples of what this looks like around the world. So the first slide, I chose my state as an example from the United States because we have several laws that criminalize people living with HIV. We have the typical non-disclosure law that you find in many parts of the world, and sometimes there may not be a specific law, but non-disclosure itself is a crime. But we have that we're required basically to disclose our HIV status prior to engaging in any unprotected sex or sharing syringes in the state of Indiana. And in our state, our law is actually called the failure to warn our partners. It's actually called duty to warn, that we in the state of Indiana have a duty to warn our sexual and needle sharing partners basically before they engage in those activities to us. We also have laws, and this is also common in some states in the United States, where it's a criminal offense, a serious criminal offense, to attempt to donate, sell, or transfer semen for artificial insemination if you're a man living with HIV, or to attempt to donate blood products or plasma while living with HIV. And these laws, of course, in the United States and around the world, basically it's perfectly safe to have children, to use reproductive technologies if you're a man living with HIV or a woman living with HIV. And then blood and plasma in the United States, basically we have pretty much our blood supply is protected from pretty much every single possible communicable disease and infectious disease, that there's absolutely no chance that even if we attempt to donate plasma, that the blood supply would be potentially put in jeopardy. Yet it's a serious criminal offense when people might engage in an attempt to just donate plasma products in the U.S. And then we have sentence enhancement laws that are linked to our general criminal laws of battery by bodily fluid and malicious mischief by bodily fluid. So these laws go from a minor crime if you do not have HIV to a serious crime in the United States, which we call a felony conviction, if you are living with HIV positive. And the important thing with these laws is body fluids. Most of the body fluids implicated can't even possibly even carry HIV. That any body fluids outside the body, including our blood, basically does not pose a risk to anybody. So it's basically merely a sentence enhancement solely linked to our HIV status. Now, when it comes to women in our state and also across the United States, we do find that women are convicted under all three types of these laws on a fairly regular kind of basis when you compare, women to men and the experiences of charges and prosecutions. So we do have women who've been charged for non-disclosure, and quite often what happens is we also have public health policies linked to our HIV non-disclosure laws, where women then public health comes after them and says you must disclose to your partners, often sometimes partners who are abusive to them, and they learn their HIV status first, but yet are required to disclose to their partners. We do have women also convicted under our attempting to donate plasma laws. And just to see the unique experiences of women, one woman's story, she basically just wanted to get diapers for her baby. And she thought, well, if I donate my plasma, I'll get $30 without realizing that it was a potential felony conviction. And then the battery and malicious mischief is also in our state kind of disproportionately impacts women, and particularly women who engage in sex work. We do find that when they're arrested under our prostitution laws, and then it's learned that they're also living with HIV, they get this malicious mischief by bodily fluid charge added to their prostitution charge, and the prostitution charge is only a minor crime in the state of Indiana, but the malicious mischief charge is a major crime in the state of Indiana. So moving on to a couple examples from other countries around the world. So I'll just chose Uganda as one example because it's also their law is very linked to the experience of women. Their HIV and AIDS Prevention and Control Bill of 2014 basically was enacted and criminalized intentional transmission of HIV, which a lot of states kind of are modernizing to only have an intentional transmission law, but which can be problematic in and of itself. But what was really problematic about the Uganda law was, along with it, it had provisions for mandatory HIV testing of pregnant women. And then with the mandatory HIV testing of pregnant women, basically both women and their partners of pregnant women must undergo mandatory HIV testing for the purpose of prevention of HIV transmission. The failure to do so, to refuse the HIV testing, may be considered an offense of similar proportion as intentional transmission of HIV and subject to similar penalties. So you can kind of see how sometimes the laws are actually enacted and directly, legally discriminate against women, particularly around their reproductive rights, their HIV testing rights, that can have severe negative consequences for their experiences in those countries. And then another example that shows a different illustration of how criminalization can occur is Canada. So Canada does not have any HIV-specific laws, but in Canada, basically, if you engage in consensual sex, in Canada, sex without consent is a crime. So consent is basically defined as there is no consent in experiences of force, threat, fear, fraud, exercise of authority. So the important item here is fraud. The Supreme Court of Canada basically has identified HIV non-disclosure amounts to fraud, which negates consent, and thus transforms consensual sexual activities into a sexual assault when there is a significant risk of seriously bodily harm, and then that would be a realistic possibility of HIV transmission, and the individual would not have consented to sex had he or she known of his or her sexual partner status. And one of our panelists is from Canada and can share more about her experiences and what's going on in Canada. Okay, so moving on, where do these laws come from? They were originally based on myths and misconceptions about HIV transmission. When applied, they reinforced fear, discrimination, stigma, and dangerous misinformation about HIV transmission and prevention. Effective HIV drugs now extend and improve the lives of people living with HIV, reduce transmission risk to effectively zero. However, the trend of HIV criminalization has increased in recent years. It makes it clear that these laws are based on irrational fears and not current scientific knowledge of HIV. So what is the impact of these laws? Basically, and kind of going back to our poll question, do these laws keep us, keep communities healthy? The answer is no. There's no evidence anywhere in all the research that has been done of any public health benefit of criminalizing people living with HIV. It's not been proven anywhere in the world to be an effective HIV prevention approach. It basically punishes people for healthful behavior of also getting tested and knowing their status. And then really critically is that almost everywhere around the world, these laws ignore legal due processes and lead to unjust prostitutions. Basically, they're based on our HIV status. They're status-based laws and not based on real, measurable intent to harm another human being, and whether harm even occurred, whether harm was even possible, and it doesn't take into account people's motives, which violates best practices of criminal legal systems and justice around the world in almost every single country. So we find they lead to unjust prosecutions and often horrendous punishments, sometimes serving years in prison, sometimes being put on a sex offender list, very harsh punishments. They also inflict tremendous group and individual harms, increased stigma and discrimination, makes it harder for people to be tested, trust health providers, get treatment if needed. And then we do find that they're especially harmful for women. So there's a bunch of questions here. We won't answer these right now. I'm only going to look at one of the questions before we kind of go into our panel. And that's, don't these laws help women? Because there is this kind of common perception that the laws are actually protective of women, that we need these laws to protect women from sexual assault, protect women from contracting HIV, protect women from violence, and that sort of thing. But what we find is actually they're incredibly harmful for women. And I'll just share some of the literature on what we found in research on what's actually happening on the ground and what happens with women with these laws. And then our panelists will share their own individual experiences. So basically, the reality is they don't protect women from HIV transmission, criminalization, or their reproductive or sexual rights. And just as one example on how they do not protect women is we do find it doesn't matter where women live in the world, that women often test HIV positive first. And that often has to do with our reproductive health, that we're going in for regular gynecological checkups. We're going in, for prenatal testing, or pregnancy testing, and often we're offered an HIV test. And this is universal around the world. And then women accept the test, they learn their HIV status in the relationship first. They might have contracted it from their male partners, but yet then they're blamed for bringing HIV into the relationship. They're more likely to be prosecuted. They're also more likely to be told that they cannot have sex without condoms, that getting pregnant or breastfeeding is against the law, and that they may be criminalized if they engage in, if they do become pregnant or if they do breastfeed. Mother-to-child transmission sometimes has also been criminalized in different parts of the world. And the laws we find do not promote honesty, they do not feel violence, they don't address gender-based sexual coercion and violence. And this is a classic catch-22 that we find happens again around the world, that domestic violence is more prevalent among women living with HIV when compared to women who do not live with HIV. And then if they disclose to their partners about their HIV status, because they often learn their status first, they may risk violence. In some cases, they may actually risk death. But at the same time, they may risk arrest if they do not disclose to their abusive partners. So what do women do? They're in this catch-22 where their options and their choices can lead to really serious harms to themselves. Then we also find that the consequences for women often are very severe, that women who are prosecuted or even accused may lose housing, child custody, access to services, and much more. This is incredibly worsened if you're in a country or you live in a state in the U.S. where sex offender status is added to your convictions. And then we also find that communities already subject to over-policing and incarceration bear the highest burden of HIV charges. So racial ethnic minorities, trans women, women who engage in sex work or use drugs. And just to give you one example of experience here, recently in Australia, a transgender woman who had worked as a sex worker in the past was convicted of previously bodily harm in Australia in the case of alleged transmission to a past partner. She is now serving an extremely harsh sentence in a men's prison in Australia, even though she is a woman, which makes the punishment even worse. So just some of these examples of how these laws particularly are harmful to women, to kind of help develop arguments in your advocacy when people say, well, don't they protect women from partners who might be dishonest, or violent towards them? Actually, we find they're not protected, and they can actually increase violence towards them, increase HIV vulnerability. Okay, so now we're going to transition into our roundtable discussion and hear from the experiences of some women themselves and what happened to them. I was going to share real briefly the experience of Julie Graham, who had a family emergency and couldn't join us today. But Julie tested positive in 2011, quickly got access to treatment, achieved an undetectable viral load. She was working as a nurse for the VA hospital and was doing really well. She's from Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, there are no HIV-specific criminalization laws. But in 2013, when she was 25 years old, she was issued a warrant for her arrest. She was charged with 4 crimes, including 2 felonies, based on allegations from a man she had dated who claimed she did not disclose her HIV status. The man who made the complaint against her did not contract HIV. To avoid being hauled off in handcuffs, She surrendered to authorities and posted a $25,000 bail. The charges against her included sexual assault and aggravated assault, each carrying maximum sentences of 10 years behind bars. The other charges were simple assault and reckless endangerment. And keep in mind, the charge here was non-disclosure that the man accused her for not telling him her HIV status. And suddenly she has all these general criminal laws, very serious crimes being charged against her. So, a long story short, Julie was able to survive that experience with the help of some tremendous legal teams that Pennsylvania has, and was able to eventually kind of do a plea bargain where she didn't do time, was able to do some kind of community service. But in the meantime, her name was put all over the media. Horrible things were said about her. She lost, she was suspended from her job at the VA, and the experience was incredibly traumatic. Even though, she was able to get most of the charges dismissed, the trauma that she experienced kind of going through with it, took a toll and continues to take a toll. But now she's become, an advocate, for HIV criminalization reform. She's gotten her job back. She's filed a lawsuit against the VA for a discrimination against her, and she continues to work basically to advocate incredibly hard on behalf of women living with HIV, and particularly women who have been criminalized. So you can read more about Julie. She is featured in the Well Project fact sheet that Krista has distributed to you all. And there's several articles about her experience on the internet and what she's doing today. One is in A&E magazine. But with that, I am going to turn it over to Krista, and she's going to facilitate our roundtable and the amazing women who are going to share their experiences today.
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you for that amazing presentation. There's a lot in this topic to go over, and I think it was really helpful to have that overview, so I appreciate that. And so I'm just going to introduce our one of our first panelists, and who will give an introduction of herself and her experience, and we'll go through the panel, and then we'll start a few questions that we have. And as I mentioned before, feel free to put in the chat or in the question box any questions you have for either Carrie or the panelists, and we'll add that into the list. Okay, so first I would love to introduce Monique Howell.
Hello, everyone. I am Monique Howell from Summerville, South Carolina. I am a survivor of HIV criminalization. I've been criminalized, HIV criminalized, when I was serving the U.S. Army back in 2007. And I always tell everyone, until that happens to you, then you'll never understand any of our HIV positive. In 2005, I was pregnant. I wasn't educated about HIV criminalization laws. I wasn't educated about what you're supposed to do for disclosure in the Army. I didn't know anything. All I knew was I was HIV positive and I was carrying a child. 2007, got involved into a relationship, did not know what to do, did not know what to say to my partner, non-disclosure. Next thing I know, I was put on trial, looking at 12 years for aggravated assault. All the charges, thank God, was dropped. However, I had to get out the Army for non-disclosure. My partner, I did not transmit the virus. While on trial, they took away my children. I had to get out of housing. Anytime I wanted to go to the store or go somewhere, I had to be monitored. All of this because of non-disclosure, because I was HIV positive. I feel like we as women, we need to be at the table. We need to be at the table to help reform these laws. We need to be at the table, and we need to allow our voices to be heard, because these HIV criminalization laws does not just today, and these crimes are very, very harsh. And like I said, until it happens to you, then you'll never understand what we truly go through. Being HIV criminalized in the Army, it caused me very trauma. I was in and out psychiatric wards after I got out the Army because I did not know what to do. I felt like I was this horrible person who committed a crime when deep down I know I did not intentionally meant to harm anyone. Had I been educated like I am now, had I was aware of each state's laws and what can happen, trust me, everything that I would have done back then would have been completely changed.
Thank you, Monique, for sharing. And I think that's really a lot of what we're trying to do is help people understand both from like the legal perspective and kind of build awareness around these laws, but also, how it has such a huge impact on people personally. So we appreciate you sharing your experiences. And next, I am going to introduce Tiami Luckett, who has been part of the Well Project's Community Advisory Board for several years and is also the Communications Coordinator for PWN.
Thank you, Krista. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, I'm Tiami Luckett. I am actually based in Little Rock, Arkansas. And what I have to add to the discussion is 3 years ago, I was leaving a Positively Trans meeting and I had to reroute in Washington to go to Charlotte, North Carolina instead of Chicago because of weather. And it was there that I met a man who was getting on the same flight. And I realized that my phone was dead. I left my charger. I was really running. So to skip to the end, he offered me a ride because I didn't have my phone. I couldn't call anybody. And once we got to my apartment, he was kind of like insistent on coming in, and being by myself, I was really hesitant. But once he was on the inside of the door, he did sexually assault me. In that time, all I could really disclose to him was that I was a transgender woman. So it didn't go as far as I thought it would go. But at that time, I still was in fear of my life because he was inside my house. And what I did not disclose to him was that I was also a trans woman living with HIV. So after talking with many other advocates for about a week and several local-based advocates within the trans community, I decided to actually press charges. But the Arkansas statute surrounding HIV criminalization is so narrowly defined that it states, penetration orally, anally, vaginally, and a person's living with HIV hasn't disclosed their status, then that is a Class A felony. So punishable by up to 6 years, according to HIV law and policy, but also would require me to have been on the sex offender registry simply because I did not tell the man who was sexually violating me that I am a trans woman living with HIV. And so I had some decisions to make. And at that time, I did not disclose to the police, but I also saw that the reporting officer took less concern in what had happened to me, the violation, simply because I was a trans woman at the time reporting it. And that was 3 years ago. I actually left Arkansas and actually moved to Pennsylvania, where there was no specific HIV criminalization statute, and kind of felt free. But I knew that there was more work to be done here in Arkansas. So I, along with other advocates now, are actually fighting to have these laws, modernized as well. And I'm working with Chris Sardina, who's now back in Arkansas from Arizona, as well as Latanja, who several of you met at HIV is Not a Crime. And I do apologize that I wasn't able to be there. But, any questions you guys have, feel free to write them down into Q&A. I'm here. Thanks, Krista.
Thank you, Tiami. And I think, you bring up a lot of points that, Carrie brought up during the presentation as well, that, it's just sometimes it's like the difficulties and the choices that you have to make. And it's not fair. So, which is why we need to revise these laws. Okay, and next I would like to introduce Tiffany Moore.
Hi, everyone. So
Hey,
I
Tiffany.
am in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I am a survivor of HIV criminalization. I was prosecuted under the aggravated prostitution statute here in Tennessee. Basically what that is once you are charged with a basic prostitution charge out of the state of Tennessee, you are forced to take an HIV test in court. And if you test positive, it's announced in the courtroom in front of everybody, and you are given a warning and released back to your life and the shock of the diagnosis and everything. But any other convictions, you are then convicted under the felony statute, and you're placed as a sex offender. So since 2002, I've been classified as a violent registered sex offender in the state of Tennessee. It's the most suffocating form of criminalization being on the registry. I now have a 4-year-old little girl, and there's no tier system in the state, so I'm under all pedophile statute restrictions. I can't take my daughter to the park. Currently right now is the hardest time of the year for me because Tennessee has what we call Operation Blackout for Halloween, and I'm not allowed to participate in anything with my daughter with costumes. I can't decorate. I got to be in by 6 p.m. Can't go to no fall festivals. So yeah, the statute here in Tennessee is definitely very painful. And back in 2015, working with Awake, Larry Frampton, Nashville Cares, and Streetworks, we were able to get aggravated prostitution before the senators. We were hoping for more of an HIV bill, but we realized very quickly that they are very far back behind with HIV. I mean, I had one senator that was even scared to shake my hand. They were really not educated on the fact that HIV just does not transmit and the advances of science and how harming this is to women, but they did start looking at the harm that this registry was causing. So we were able to enact Public Chapter 469, but now the process of that is very difficult. As women, we have to go back up before trial, and we have to prove that we were a victim of violence, of domestic violence, rape, sex trafficking. We have to prove ourselves to come off of the registry. So yeah, Tennessee is there's definitely no legislation as I know of yet with HIV. It's a very suffocating state, very not open to the advances, and there's no fight. I mean, using protection, being undetectable, none of that matters. You're just plagiarized all over. I was put all over the news, in the newspaper. Housing is very difficult. If I lose my housing, I can't live within 1,000 feet of a park, school, church, with a playground. I can't work. I can't attend Positively Living here. They offered me a job, offered a chance for me to at least put in my application and groups. I can't even attend that because it's in a school zone, so I can't even attend HIV support groups there because I would be in violation of the registry. So yeah, that's my story, and that's what I'm currently living under in Tennessee.
Well, thank you, Tiffany, for sharing. I mean, I think to see the real.
The most painful thing is I've been undetectable for over a decade. So it's very, it's heartbreaking to know that I didn't pass. I didn't intentionally pass in prostitution. I used protection when I had a right to use protection. I'm not going to tell an assailant in the middle of an assault that, hey, by the way, I'm not going to further put myself in harm, but there's no protection here. Just like Tommy was saying, I mean, even I couldn't have brought one of my rapists to court because I didn't disclose. I would have been prosecuted. It would have been a flip prosecution. You know, they would have prosecuted him as well again.
Yeah, so I mean, so this is a very, one example and a very, in this extreme of people with kids, and you can imagine, like Tiffany is talking about Operation Blackout during Halloween. It's another very important reason why we need to work on these laws. But thank you for sharing, and I think it's really important that people, again, just realize the impact that this can have on someone's personal life. Okay, Jessica Whitbread is with us from now I'm going to say it wrong, but I'll let you introduce yourself, where you're calling in from.
Okay, hi everyone. My name's Jessica Whitbread. I'm a Canadian, but I'm currently living in Kyrgyzstan, which is in Central Asia. So a bit about myself. So one, I'm a mother and have babies, and one is experiencing night terrors as we speak. So he will come and join me in the webinar.
So Jessica's she's on her own tonight with her twin. She's at night there, and one of her experiences there. So if you need to just jump off, we can totally accommodate it.
But it's fitting because I'm going to talk about them and my experience with them. Look, Ivan, you're on a webinar. There you go. Okay, so come on. Hold on, please, one second. I'm so sorry.
It's okay. We all understand. This is a good example of sometimes, as we welcome everyone at the Well Project, but, sometimes there's a very powerful reason why.
Okay. Sorry. Okay, so we have a new guest. He's a 2-year-old, part of a twin group. Anyway, I've been an activist, artist, mother, living on working on criminalization issues for about the past 10 plus years. It first started when I contracted HIV. My story is a bit of a flip side from, as a quote unquote, I experienced it from, and I'll say quote unquote victim role. I don't identify as that, but as the criminal courts kind of placed me, that's where I would be. And I contracted it from an HIV from a boyfriend that was not completely honest about his own sexual health. We're in a toxic relationship, and it, as many women in particular experience, it was abusive and crappy in many ways. And I think me contracting HIV was just a part of it. So in 2006, his name was all over the media, and he was ultimately charged and convicted of aggravated sexual assault in a Canadian context by 2 other women. I sat through the entire process, and I watched it, and though I did not charge him myself, I was there and I felt it. And it was at that time I realized that, although he was kind of an asshole, thank you, Ivan, and there's no excuse for his actions, but, he didn't have the tools to work through it. And I really felt that this was probably not the way that it could have been dealt with. And I know a few people on the poll said that they were interested in charging a former partner, but in my experience, the charging of my ex did not make me feel better, or I didn't see that it made any of the women feel any better, and they continued and questioned what they did later. But HIV criminalization has, beyond my sex life, because after, it impacts the way that I navigate sex, as many of you probably experience. As one of my friends said, the worst thing about a drunken bar disclosure is having to do it again in the morning. So, and the other way that... Yes, Ivan. The other way that I've experienced is it through, I advocated to breastfeed my children. So a lot of women and people who do HIV criminalization work, we don't talk about women's entirety of reproductive rights when we think about criminalization. So, you know, in a North American context, women living with HIV are told that they cannot breastfeed, but in other developing parts of the world, in particular like African context, women are told that they actually must breastfeed and can't give formula, which can be really confusing. And you know, current research, because I've been working on this topic for a long time, shows kind of women that are undetectable have basically, to make it simplified, a less than 1% chance, possibly, of passing on HIV to their children. You know, and I really felt that in what I wanted to do after a lot of thought was to breastfeed my twins. So it's a tough discussion and a hard one that people are, I think it reminds me of a pro-life, pro-choice debate, and it's really difficult. And so in saying this, I'm not saying that breast is best. Fed is obviously best, but for me, I felt like this was what I wanted to do. And so I worked with a healthcare team for months to develop and to encourage them to support me in my plan to breastfeed, which would be the first time in Canada that anyone had been allowed to. I was not allowed to openly talk about it because the risks were so the risks were so great. Women historically have had their babies taken away. They have had by Child Protective Services, families torn apart, and in some cases, women have been charged and convicted of, in a Canadian context, a woman was charged for negligence in relation to breastfeeding because she was positive, and in other parts of the world, women have been charged. Most recently, there was a case in Kenya, even though it's a bit odd because they say that one should. So I spent basically the entire time, despite having a team, being under heavy surveillance once it was finally, I was allowed to do it. Monitored every week to make sure that I was giving them treatment despite not being positive. And also, you know, after I did it for 3 months with a team of 7 doctors, like leading experts supporting me, the worst scenario did happen, and someone did call public health on me, most likely a nurse or a social worker or someone who had heard that I was doing it. So while my doctors did advocate for me, I spent, and ultimately, I guess it was okay, but I just needed to do some counseling from public health. But I spent, I just remember this time where I just spent a whole 24-hour segment developing an escape plan for my partner, because I was in Jamaica doing a workshop when I got a call saying that that public health was looking for me, and I just made it, how could my partner take the babies away and so they wouldn't have to be impacted by people's ignorance and people's disdain for women living with HIV. So yeah, it was like those feelings were real and scary. And I share this also because I know so many women from doing this work for a long time who are living with HIV, not only in North America, but globally, who want to breastfeed, who maybe want to formula feed. They want to be part of their decision making in what they do. And, many people do it in secret. I know one woman who was on a call with the International Community of Women Living with HIV, who she talked about 6 months not leaving her house, not letting anyone in so she could breastfeed her child. And many of the women are completely unsupported in the decisions that they feel are best for them and their families. So I guess in closing, I just want to say that HIV criminalization impacts women's experience with HIV in more than just sex, and it impacts the entirety of women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I'm very interested in these days to talk about that and how to better support women in their choices and having access to the most current and update information. Thank you. Sorry, and thank you everyone for putting up with the crying.
No, thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you for being able to, I know you've got your hands full literally, and to be able to speak to all of that in the meantime, and we really appreciate it. And I think you bring yet another really important fact up, and it's something that we're actually going to be putting out a fact sheet in the coming weeks on breastfeeding and HIV, and likely do a webinar on that topic. But because there is so many questions around it, and it it definitely, when it comes to criminalization, we just recently were kind of looped into a case right here in New York City where a provider reported a woman living with HIV to Child Protective Services who had her babies taken away because she was breastfeeding. And so, I mean, it can happen anywhere. And so we've kind of been looped in with a team, and the woman now has her child back, but there's still a case pending. So we definitely need to work together to kind of make sure people are educated. So once again, I want to just, before we move on to some of the panel questions, I just want to really thank everyone, Monique, Tiami, Tiffany, and Jessica, for sharing. As we mentioned, this is not easy, as everyone can hear. I mean, they're speaking about it in, a very, nice way that they're sharing this with us, but I mean this has all been very difficult situations for everyone. So I know some of you have talked about this, but one of the questions that we have, and anyone can jump in and answer, and then we have other questions if you want to pass on this question if you feel like you addressed it already. But the first question we have for the panel is, what have been the lasting impacts of HIV criminalization on you personally, and how do you manage that?
Okay, this is Tiami. Personally, what it did for me at the time was that I went back into, isolation again. I needed therapy. I stayed in the fetal position. I lost weight. It affected me psychosociologically, everything was affected. I literally could not move. I was forgetting stuff at work. And I also took myself off the market, again, kind of reverted to when I learned of my diagnosis and how I just did not want to be the person to transmit the virus. And the thing is, it also made me more cognizant of relationships and things that could happen. So being in a relationship now, I disclosed several years ago. And, this guy actually was like, I want all of you. He didn't want me to compartmentalize myself. I am free to be who I am, and all that comes with that. And it was one thing that he said that, like, took me back because I didn't know how to feel about it. He's like, I want all of you, everything that comes with you. And so basically, he just told me, he was like, even if that meant like HIV and we're together, I'm cool with that. And it makes me smile, but it also like causes me some pause because I'm still here in Arkansas. I can never forget my surroundings, and I don't want to end up on the sex offender registry. That's not my life. I'm not a pedophile. I'm not any of those things, I'm not a deviant simply because I'm trans. Yeah, it just made me really more cognizant of relationships and things that could happen. And I don't trust men. I'm sorry, I don't. I just don't trust them. That level of trust was broken when that guy attacked me. And even after I disclosed that I was trans, he continued to attack me. And it was like it was much more of a deep-seated hatred that I witnessed. And that stayed with me. It did. So it has definitely caused some trust issues since then. And that was 3 years ago. But I'm reminded of it every day that I'm in Arkansas. But this is where I want to be. This is home. And I don't want to have to run from my home to feel safe.
Yeah.
Can I add to that? This is Monique.
Please.
My experience, it was very traumatized afterwards. Like I said before, I was in and out psychiatric wards. I didn't even want to be around no men. I felt like I couldn't date nobody anymore. Or I felt like when I wanted to be in a relationship, that was like the first thing I had to say, hey, I'm HIV positive, because the laws make me felt like I just had to come out and say it right then and there. But now I'm thankful that I was able to love myself and I was able to slowly heal from all that trauma. And now I'm finding more men are very accepting when I am honest and I'm just like, hey, get to know me first. And once I disclose my status, they yet continue to want to love me for me. However, it is very, very traumatized when you're going through that process by yourself and you don't have anyone to turn to. So when I was in that psych ward, I just wanted to just die because I felt like, at least that's how the laws, like I always say, the laws made me feel like that. So I just wanted to be, and I just wanted to give up. And I didn't even want to date nobody. As Yana said, I didn't, I was like, I don't trust nobody because it was done to me. And now here I am going through a process that I did not intentionally meant to do. I'm at now when I'm dating, I'm like, oh my God, what if I have to go back through this process again? If I date, how am I, what happens if they turn against me and this happens again? So I have constant flashbacks when I'm in another relationship.
Thank you, Monique. Yeah, I mean, even, notwithstanding HIV criminalization laws, I mean, we have many women that we work with and in our community, just when they have HIV, feel like this is not, dating is over and having, relationships is over. And then when you add this and you've gone through it, I can only imagine the trauma and feeling to withdraw. Does anyone else want to answer that question?
Yeah, it's Jessica. So I feel like that I could say from many angles here, but I'll stick to in relation to the breastfeeding. So I pretty much spiraled into long-term postpartum depression after being the first to try to breastfeed and advocate to do so was incredibly hard and taxing. I from things like, being given biohazard bags to store my milk in, and being told that I was wrong, or like I was going to give it to them. Like all these comments you can only push off for so long until and they slowly grate away at you. But I guess I also want to bring up this other scenario because I think it's a good example in relation to the sex. Having sex, I remember this one time I always felt quite invincible, that I had so much control over my disclosure. And one night after a party, I was sleeping and was assaulted by someone. I woke up with their hands in my pants, and it was, I was like, oh, what do I do? And this was probably about 15 years since I had HIV and doing this work. And I was like, do I want to disclose? I'm sleeping. I don't feel safe to do that. What if he's angry? What if this happens? And so I was like, okay, I can't disclose because it's hard. And then I was like, and that's not what I signed up for, to be rejected, to be like told them dirty, or like to get away, or experience violence. And so I decided that I would just lay there, which felt incredibly, because I knew that if I actively participated or didn't say anything, then I could be charged with aggravated sexual assault. And that experience, eventually it stopped, but I think that experience just reminded me that even if you do cross your T's and dot your I's and do everything, as in particular a woman living with HIV, if you're assaulted, it can be flipped against you, and then you would be charged instead.
Thank you, Jessica. So it's good seeing the chat and kind of people understanding just the vast impact that this can have. And I again appreciate everyone sharing their experiences. I will move on to another question. We'll probably take a couple more questions, and then we'll leave some time for the Q&A. So have your perspectives on criminalization changed through your personal experience? And if so, how?
This is Tiffany. I know for what I've been through, not so much has changed, just bringing more awareness to where you're seeing individuals all through the newspaper, and I get them through the feed of my email, someone being charged, and just myself as going through the diagnosis and how it was announced in court, and no process of going through it. It just leads a different perspective for myself, that you really just don't know how somebody is managing, and how do you manage unless you have a support group, and we don't all begin with a support group. So it's definitely, I would not prosecute myself, even if I wasn't positive, knowing what I know now, because it's a very lonely road. It can be a lonely road unless you've got that strong advocacy and your understanding of what it is. Prosecuting is just not, it doesn't serve on either side for me. You don't win. You get positive. I understand someone's angry with that. I understand the definition of a diagnosis, but there's a whole other picture to also that person that was HIV positive. Do they have a support? How are they dealing with it? Could they tell you? How do you tell it? That's a discussion that I think is so important now, is, the stigma. That's hopefully what's getting out, and what we start talking about, so people don't have to live in fear. It's just like cancer. I'm a cancer survivor. You know, everyone's so openly with, you know, breast awareness and the pink, but let a red ribbon come out and it's, you know, oh my God, why are you wearing that shirt? You know, it's very sad, and it's scary for someone with HIV, and it brought awareness of me being diagnosed. You know, I was raped, but I wouldn't go back and I wouldn't prosecute just because, honestly, as darkening as it is, what was that person going through? Even though I didn't deserve it, there's such a ripple effect to everything. So it definitely has changed my perspective, seeing other people prosecuted and just knowing that, you know, there is two sides. It's not fair. I mean, I'm not saying it's fair, but there is still there's two stories.
Yeah. Thank you.
I agree with Tiffany. I mean, until it happens to you, I mean, we all here, we've experienced it, and my perspective would have been is very different now. I wouldn't just go and prosecute. We are strong women, you know, that have so much impact that we can do for this world, for this country. But to prosecution, that's not the answer. That's not the answer. We need to dig deeper and see case by case, not just, okay, just throw that person behind bars. Like Tiffany said, I mean, you bring out the red ribbon, the red shirts, everybody runs. But other cases, everybody's right there supporting those individuals.
Yes.
And like I said, this is Tiami. It just made me like even more determined to get rid of these laws. You know, I literally wasn't safe. I didn't do anything. I was simply in a tough spot. And that's how I interacted with the legal system. Yeah, it just makes me even more determined to right what was done so long ago, back in the 80s when we didn't know anything about HIV. And it was out of fear, but now people are just choosing to remain willfully ignorant. And that hurts. You know, I don't feel safe, like just as an individual, because of the stigma that's attached to having a positive diagnosis. I don't think I'll ever feel safe anywhere that I go until the laws are repealed. I tried to run, but I didn't feel safe there either. You know, there was a sexual assault in Philly. So how do I just walk around being able to feel good about being myself in the fullness thereof, as I am? Will I ever make it? Will it take me actually fighting to get these laws repealed to actually do that? It'll be one less thing to make me feel safe, hopefully.
Thank you. Can you still all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. My computer screen just kind of went out. But hopefully, I mean, hopefully it's not out on other people's ends. I'm going to try and fix it. But thank you all for sharing that as well. So I think we'll do, we'll maybe do one more question and skip to some Q&A, and then if we have time, we'll go back. So I am going to ask, for those of you who are in advocacy and have some ideas, I mean, we'll have some resources in the slide set at the end of how to get involved and then learn more. But, you know, do you have any thoughts of, you know, how, I mean, this might be too big of a question in this time frame, but how do you think HIV criminalization laws should be reformed? Yeah, like I said, that might be like.
I think I think that's a pretty huge question.
Yeah.
Especially like if I think about like at a country level, a state level, and then you go at a global level. And I don't know. I think the U.S. in particular, the U.S. and Canada sets has set a dangerous precedent globally around HIV criminalization laws.
Okay. So the only thing I wanted to say about modernization of the laws, the question that Jessica, she had kind of answered kind of from a global perspective and going on. And I know that here in the United States, we run into an issue of sometimes repeal is really not an option, given our political climate, that our state legislators would never support repeal. So, and then we also run into the issue that so many people are criminalized under general laws, that if you don't have an HIV specific law, then you can still be prosecuted under our general laws in the United States. And that's what happened in Texas. They repealed their HIV specific law, and then people started prosecuting people living with HIV for just crazy, insane things that made no sense, and having really harsh sentences in Texas. So right now, like, we're working on modernizing our HIV specific laws in the state of Indiana, and we're going towards a mixture of repeal and modernization our laws. And when you modernize a law, and if you are going to have an HIV specific law, it's really important to make sure that that law follows best criminal justice practices in your country. So it's based on real measurable intent to harm another person, and then did harm actually occur, and then the punishment should be proportional to that harm. But and that's just general kind of feedback on modernizing the laws, and I are going to have an HIV specific law. But importantly, you can think about, when you're doing this, how do these laws, if you are going to have an HIV specific law on the book, how does it directly impact women and some of the experiences that you heard? So one thing you can do is you can build in protections for women who are pregnant. You can build in protections in your law for women, for breastfeeding, so that if they, choose to become pregnant, if they choose to breastfeed, that these HIV specific laws cannot be used against them. So often I think when people modernize the laws, they're not thinking about the unique experiences of women when they decide, what are we going to advocate for in terms of language? So it could be something as simple as you just say that becoming pregnant while one has a communicable disease, or acquiring a communicable disease while pregnant, continuing a pregnancy while one has a communicable disease, or declining treatment for communicable disease while pregnant shall not result in any kind of criminal liability. You can advocate to include language like that in your modernization law reforms. And then somebody in the chat box had asked me to comment. Someone had made a comment about situations of rape. So if somebody who rapes another person is living with HIV, the idea was, well, maybe we should have laws, HIV-specific laws, that maybe have sentence enhancement or added charges for them. And we do have a slide on that, and it is covered. That particular question is covered in the Well Project handout. And for what I would say there is that basically sexual assault laws should be punishing that person, and it's hard enough to enact sexual assault laws, particularly when it occurs within marriage around the world. And then if you're going to be talking about HIV, again, the person should not experience heightened sentence enhancements solely because they're HIV positive, but it should go back to measurable harm. Did harm actually occur? But basically, sexual assault laws are what we should be advocating for in terms of prosecution for people who engage in sexual assault who are also living with HIV. So those are just 2 points about the modernization, and then answering that one question that I was asked to answer in the chat box. I'm going on mute now. And then just one more thing, since nobody else was talking, to just add on this, the stories that we heard today, I'm kind of choking up, because every time I hear stories of criminalization, particularly as women, because I'm a woman and I can relate, this could happen to me. It's just a constant reminder of why we do the work we do to end HIV criminalization. Our stories matter. And I think with women, we don't hear the stories of women enough. We hear more the stories of men than victims of criminalization. And it's really important for us as advocates to bring those stories in because they do, women do have, they have similar experiences, but they have different experiences. And it's important to share those because those stories are just so powerful in eliciting even more support for your efforts to end the criminalization of people living with HIV. So I just wanted to add that in there and thank the amazing panelists for sharing their stories today.
This is Jenna Conley with the Well Project. Can you guys hear me? Okay. I just wanted to thank everybody for joining the call and to echo what Carrie just said. This is a really challenging conversation to have, and we so really profoundly appreciate the willingness of all of our speakers to share their experiences and their stories. And for all of you who joined us and participated in the webinar and shared some of your own experiences and stories in the chat, we really, really appreciate it. I want to apologize on behalf of the Well Project for the technical issues that we had. Krista had to log off. I think it was her phone that was causing some of the issues, so she says she's sorry. We'll follow up via email with some additional questions and information. But just one final thank you to everybody for being part of this today and for bearing with us through some of the challenges. And with that, I think that we will be ending the call for today. So thank you again.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody.